Before I really get into the sermon talking about Elijah, I wanted to just share a couple pictures with you from our garden mission and how that's going on. You know, in the last year, we purchased a property down in Baltimore City, and we've been working on renovations and getting going there. And Randy has been working as a missionary into that area and also helping lead the initiative. And for those of you who walked through it when it was kind of a mess and we first got it, I just wanted to give you an update of how it's coming together and how it's looking. And so, I wasn't paying attention first. There we go. Look at that. I think that just looks incredible. And so if you walk through, that was like an abandoned bar and there was stuff sticking out of the floor everywhere and it looked terrible. But we're really making some progress in terms of how that's looking and where it's heading. And some big decisions are coming soon about how we're going to use this ministry space and what it's going to look like. We talked with the church board this last week. We met. And I'm just really excited about where it's going. And I'm also excited about this idea. I don't know how much you've heard me talk about this, but I think that churches or ministries have tended to do this thing where you invite people to church first, and once you're in church, then you could be discipled, and once you're discipled, then you can be an evangelist and an outreach, and once you're into outreach, you can start doing community ministry and social justice and all that kind of stuff. And Americans and Western people have typically developed in their Christian faith in that direction. And we're trying to do those four things, but in the opposite direction, I guess, if you really could. We're trying to care for the neighborhood and the community and do justice work and tell people we care and we love them, and then help them come and be a part of discipleship ministries out of that, and then lead into worship services eventually. And so I don't know that it's ever written in the Bible that these pillars of four things that churches do have to be done in the order that we do them in the West. And so we're trying to come in the back door and do things backward and eventually, hopefully, move on to see that people who are far from God come near to God through our ministry there. But I wanted to share a little bit with what's going on there, make sure you're staying updated, that things are moving and happening, and it's really exciting. I don't know if you see this heater in the middle there. It's attached to gas, and I was there with Gary Porter this week, and he told me that if you turn the gas on and then hold the gas for 15 seconds, he told me, and then you ignite it, it'll turn on. And I tried that and almost burned the whole place down. I'm lucky that I still have eyelashes, if I'm honest with you. There was a big explosion of fire. So if Gary's ever giving you advice how to turn fire on, he's not your man. He does lots of things really well, but yeah, we were almost on the news this week between me and Gary, so interesting stuff. Anyways, on to Elijah. We have been talking about Elijah for the whole month of February, and I hope you've enjoyed breaking down the story of this great prophet of the Old Testament. And today we're going to continue talking about him, in particular about how he handed his ministry on. When his time was over as a prophet, how he passed it on to Elisha. And I think this is particularly appropriate for our world today, especially because I think we have so many crises, especially emotional and mental crises, and we have just struggle upon struggle upon struggle in our world. And I think the story of Elijah, how when his story comes to an end, how he has prepared someone to carry on, how he's invested in someone, could be so meaningful for the way we think about attacking the struggles of our world today. In particular, because you remember last week we talked about Elijah being lonely and depressed and away from people. He was the hero of the story. He was the one who had the power of God on his side. He was the one for whom God was answering prayers. Everything about Elijah should make us think, dude, his life is going okay. He's got it. He's the alpha, the main character. He is the center of everything right. And still, he ends up sad and lonely and away from people and alone, thinking very, very negative thoughts. And so it's interesting to then process how he gets out of that. You may recall that last week we ended by God shows up to him, speaking to him in just a little whisper. And he says, listen, buddy, you can't just stay here. You got to go. You got to get moving. And when you go and get moving, you're going to find that there's a young guy named Elisha who wants to be mentored by you, and that there are 7,000 people who are like-minded, who have not kneeled down to Baal. You are not alone. But Elijah's not going to find out that he's not alone if he just stays alone in the cave. He's got to get up, get out, trust God, and find these things. And so Elijah does that, and he runs into Elisha. And Elisha becomes a very, very important character in the book of 2 Kings. And he becomes that because Elijah invests in him, gets to know him, spends time with him, and mentors him. And so before we get there, I want to talk a little bit about what I think is the problem, or I can't get to the bottom of the problem with living today, but we could talk a little bit about some of the problems. And by doing so, I want to do through the lens of an article I've read recently by a guy named David Brooks. David Brooks is a political author. He writes for The Atlantic currently. He used to write for the New York Times. If you go to Barnes & Noble, you can see all of his books in the front section. He's pretty easy to find. But he wrote an article that I read called How America Got Mean. I think that's a pretty provocative title. Some of you might be thinking, well, America's not mean. No, I guess you are thinking that, aren't you? Okay. How America Got Mean. And he notes that among Americans that there has been, over the last 20 to 50 years, an incredible rise of hatred, anxiety, and fear. He also noted that in this rise of hatred, anxiety, and fear, he said that since 2000 to now, we're in 2025 now, in the last 25 years, suicide rates are up 30% in the last 25 years. That's a sobering statistic, isn't it? Just anecdotally, he was talking to people in this interview. He said that one professor was talking about travels to places like Oklahoma, a Zoom meeting. He'd just been in like 4 or 5 different places, and every single place, every single person had been touched by suicide that he talked to. He just asked, do you know anyone who's committed suicide? Every single person raised their hand. And this is just in the last few years. There's been this incredible rise. And not just suicide. So, of course, suicide rates are up 30%, but that doesn't mean 30% of people are committing suicide. Right? But there is a mental health problem underneath all of that. And it's identified by things like increased amount of sadness and loneliness and self-harm. And if you don't know anyone that's committed suicide, my guess is you can point to people who have articulated those problems in their own life. That people have been touched by suicide, sadness, loneliness, and self-harm. And all of those things eventually turn into bitterness, right? It eventually turns into bitterness. If you feel as though your life is so difficult that you're identifying those things, it's hard to not turn into bitterness eventually. And so people who are bitter, who are hurting, who are struggling, eventually tend to feel as though they're invisible, unheard, or they become victims, right? And the number one thing that people are trying to get you to feel today is a victim. Everyone wants you to feel a victim. This is how politicians are fighting for your vote. They are not trying to articulate a better world. They're not trying to fix problems. They're not trying to help you. They want you to feel like you are a victim. This is number one, right? The government is stealing your money. People who have different ethnic or sexual identities than you are trying to ruin your culture. I mean, just on and on and on. They're trying to create this victim mentality. And the problem is that whoever is the biggest victim is the winner in the society. And so even if we're kind of feeling good, we still are prone to this idea of victimhood. And we want to be victims, and we want to articulate ourselves as victims. And the truth of the matter is every once in a while we are a victim. And so when they get to the place where we're vulnerable, we get riled up. We get all excited. And so David Brooks in this article goes through what he says are the 4 explanations for this, although he finds them all unsatisfactory. But my guess is you've probably heard of these before. There are 4 different areas that people often talk about, especially sociologists, that we think are the rise of this problem in the last 25 years. The first story is the technology story, that social media is driving us all crazy. And to that I say, that is absolutely true. I guarantee you that social media has done more harm to your life and your mental status than it has done good. The problem is the uptick in suicide, self-harm, mental health crisis is kind of uniquely American, and social media can be found in every country in the world. And so it's not like social media is doing this to us, although I think it's a factor, it helps. Another story is the sociology problem in America. We've stopped participating in community organizations, and we start feeling more isolated. So we're less likely to volunteer, we're less likely to be involved in something bigger than ourselves, and because of this, we feel overwhelmed, we feel tired, we feel driven down, so we don't get involved in things, and then we go to work, we go home, we wake up the next day, we go to work, we go home, and eventually we feel more and more isolated. And some of this is just our own choice. The other story that you might have heard is the demography problem, that America has long been dominated by white folks, and the country is becoming increasingly diverse, and it has put millions of white Americans in a panic. You've probably heard that story before as well. There are people that think that's the reason America is getting so mean and having such struggles. And then there's the economic problem as well, that high levels of economic inequality have left people afraid and pessimistic and alienated from each other. And there's probably some truth in each of these four things. There's probably some people who have become angry or mean or disassociated or struggling with mental health or whatever because some bit of each of these four things. But this is what David Brooks argues, and I think it's really helpful as well, is that none of those four things are actually the problem, although they may have something to say about it. But he wonders if the real problem is that we're no longer doing moral formation in American culture anymore. These are some of the proofs that he says. You may think to yourself, I'm moral. I learned morals. I learned morals from my parents. Well, that's great. But listen to these numbers that are staggering, I think. In 1967, 85% of college freshmen articulated that they were motivated by a deep and meaningful philosophy of life. 85%. In 2000, the year 2000, which by the way, in case you're wondering how old these people are, my wife Sharice and I were both freshmen in the year 2000, college freshmen. So mid-40s, these are adults now. Only 42% said that they were motivated by a deep and meaningful philosophy of life. The drop over 33 years was from 85 to 42%, cut in half. In 2012, there was a study done in books that were being published in America, just American books being published. And they noticed that over the last 50 years, that there had been a drop in the usage of words like bravery, gratitude, and humbleness by 65, 58, and 55% in books being published. And so morality teaches you to be brave, teaches you to be grateful, it teaches you to be humble, among many other things. Morality often teaches you to think beyond just your inner self, to see the community, to see others, to understand how other people work and operate and who they are. And in just the books that are being published, we see the sort of things that teach this thing is dropping on an incredible decline. And so we also know that church attendance has dropped over the last 25 to 50 years. We know that family engagement, like large families getting together, is dropping because people move because of jobs all over the country. And so the question we should ask ourselves is, who's training ourselves to think of others? Who's training ourselves to care for people? Who's thinking about the whole? Who's teaching us to be kind? Well, when we start having a vacuum of moralism, moral training, thinking of others, what fills that vacuum? It doesn't just go empty. The truth of the matter is, what fills it is politics and tribalism. And so we want to feel included somewhere, somehow, some way. We don't want to be lonely and alone, and so we look for things to fill these vacuums in our life. And we think that we can probably do good by aligning with a political movement that is meaningful. And so people then begin to divide on those lines. And the problem is like, you can log on to any Reddit forum and have people tell you and scream and holler what you want to hear. You can turn on your news channel of choice and see people very, very angry, red in the face, screaming and hollering what you want to believe. You can open a Twitter or X account and find all of the follows that you want that believe exactly the same thing you do. And you can spend all day getting outraged about the way things are in the world. And none of those things ever build community. You're still alone. And now you're just alone and angry. And so this is becoming more and more definitive and defining of who we are becoming as American people. And it seems to me as well that the predominant argument that American culture is trying to make to us is that you are an individual, you are a person, you matter. Everything about you matters. Who you are, what your tastes are, what you believe, who you want to have sex with, who you want to identify with, how much money you want to make, what kind of career you have. You are an individual, you are a person. Your tastes, your longings, your desires are good. Let them run free, let them go. Let them experience stuff. It's all good. This is kind of the predominant American narrative. And even if you want to buy that hook, line, and sinker, if you follow that logic all the way to its very end, what you end up finding is that I am a complete self. I'm a person. I'm an individual. And at the very end of that, how do you ever defeat loneliness when you're the only person in the world like you? How in the world can you ever find community or friendship if there's never anything you're willing to let go of or to question or to ask? Is this good? How can you ever find meaning or connection when at the end of the day, you're the only one like this in the whole world? And so individualism, I think, leads us to loneliness more than anything else does. And while there's something really, really good about individualism, about believing in yourself, about liking yourself, about getting to know yourself, about understanding yourself, standing up for yourself, well, there's something beautiful and good about all of that. The end of it is naturally loneliness, because no one else is like me. And the more we're trained and taught to think of ourselves as an ego, as a self, and the less and less we are asked to check anything about ourselves, the more and more we're going to eventually end up lonely. And when we're lonely, we become bitter. And when we're lonely, we become a victim. And we're increasing in victimhood. Let's remember that Elijah himself helps us out because, well, Elijah was a great prophet, a brilliant leader, an incredible orator, very near and close to God. He was also righteous, moral, and lonely. And so there's so much about his story that is right. He does the right thing over and over and over and over, and yet he ends up alone in a cave, filled with his righteousness, filled with his morals, filled with victory upon victory under the power of God, and he still ends up alone. And when he's alone, God doesn't come and care for him in his loneliness and say, it's okay, buddy, you've done everything right. Let me give you a hug, and then we'll just die together in here. He says, no, you got to get going, dude. Keep moving. There's more life to live. You've got to go out there. And God's solution for Elijah is go and find someone to mentor. Like, dude, you've got a lot going for you. I saw you on the top of Mount Carmel. You called that fire down. That was pretty good, man. Why don't you go show someone else how to do that? Why don't you go someone who's behind you? Because you're not going to live forever. You're not going to last forever. How about you get out here and find out that not only does Elisha want to learn from you, but there's 7,000 people out there that believe just like you, that have the same faith as you, that have the same morals as you, that have the same life as you. How about you get out of the cave and go find them and see if that doesn't help you out a little bit? And I think it's fascinating that God's solution, like so often we want God's solution to our darkness, our struggle, our hurt, our depression, if you will, our loneliness, is fix it for me, God. Help me out, fix it for me. I've got problems. You be a solution. Let me know when you've got my problems figured out. And God's solution to Elijah is get going, get moving, be brave. What would it change for you if you understood God in that way? What would it change for you If instead of telling God what you need out of God, you trusted God enough when you heard him say, get going, get moving. You'll find me in the journey along the way. Would that change anything for you? Well, today I want to read the end of the story in 2 Kings, because the end of the story is startling, it's surprising, but it's also helpful as well, I think. And I think in it we can find some meaning for what to do with this life and what we could possibly provide to a world that's hurting, that's alone, that's struggling, that's bitter, that's suicidal, that's depressed, that's lonely, it's alone. These are all problems we see in our world. And it's really easy for us, especially when we're like okay, to point our fingers back at the world and say, get it right, dude. You should know better. But I think in the end of the story of Elijah, it gives us a picture of something we can do. And what we can do isn't solve all the problems of the world. What we can't do is just name what the solution is to all the problems and then laugh at it on Facebook about how stupid the world is. But the solution that Elijah comes up with is grab one person and bring them along with you. And it may be possible that rather than solving the world, rather than fixing the world, rather than telling the world what's wrong with us, the best thing God could have for us is grab someone and bring them along with us. And instead of thinking in macro terms all the time, every once in a while, just follow God in the micro and see what happens. Our text today is 2 Kings chapter 2. We're going to read verses 1 to 18. I invite you, if you would, to stand with me as we read the word of the Lord. 2 Kings, starting with verse 1. When the Lord was about to take Elijah up to heaven in a whirlwind, Elijah and Elisha were on their way to Gilgal. Elijah said to Elisha, "Stay here. The Lord has sent me to Bethel." But Elisha said, "As surely as the Lord lives, and as you live, I will not leave you." So they went down to Bethel. The company of the prophets at Bethel came out to Elisha and asked, "Do you know that the Lord is going to take your master from you today?" "Yes, I know," Elisha replied. "So be quiet." It's great. Then Elijah said to him, "Stay here, Elisha. The Lord has sent me to Jericho." And he replied, "As surely as the Lord lives, and as you live, I will not leave you." So they went to Jericho. The company of the prophets at Jericho went up to Elisha and asked him, "Do you know that the Lord is going to take your master from you today?" "Yes, I know," he replied. "So be quiet." Then Elijah said to him, "Stay here, the Lord has sent me to the Jordan." And he replied, "As surely as the Lord lives, and as you live, I will not leave you." So the two of them walked on. 50 men from the company of the prophets went and stood at a distance, facing the place where Elijah and Elisha had stopped at the Jordan. Elijah took his cloak, rolled it up, and struck the water with it. The water divided to the right and to the left, and the two of them crossed over on dry ground. When they had crossed, Elijah said to Elisha, "Tell me, what can I do for you before I'm taken from you?" "Let me inherit a double portion of your spirit," Elisha replied. "You have asked a difficult thing," Elijah said. "Yet, if you see me when I'm taken from you, it will be yours. Otherwise, it will not." As they were walking along and talking together, suddenly a chariot of fire and horses of fire appeared and separated the two of them. And Elijah went up into heaven in a whirlwind. Elisha saw this and cried out, my father, the chariots and horsemen of Israel." And Elisha saw him no more. And he took hold of his garment and tore it in two. Elisha then picked up Elijah's cloak that had fallen from him and went back and stood on the bank of the Jordan. He took the cloak that had fallen from Elijah and struck the water with it. "Where now is the Lord, the God of Elijah?" he asked. When he struck the water, it divided to the right and the left, and he crossed over. The company of the prophets from Jericho who were watching said, "The spirit of Elijah is resting on Elisha." And they went to meet him and bowed to the ground before him. "Look," they said, "we, your servants, have 50 able men. Let them go and look for your master. Perhaps the Spirit of the Lord has picked him up and set him down on the mountain or in some valley." "No," Elisha replied, "do not send them." But they persisted until he was too embarrassed to refuse. So he said, "Send them." And they sent 50 men who searched for 3 days but did not find him. When they returned to Elisha, who was staying in Jericho, he said to them, "Didn't I tell you not to go?" What a great end to the story. This is the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. You may be seated. So we have in this story just an incredible moment, one that lives all the way through the New Testament, is referenced over and over and over. You may know that when John the Baptist comes and is baptizing and eventually baptizes Jesus, the whispering among the crowd is, hey, maybe this is what happened to Elijah. He didn't die. He was taken up into heaven. Maybe he's been sent back down to us to prepare the way for the Messiah. You may also know that while Jesus is ministering, he goes up onto a mountain one day, and there's the transfiguration where Jesus is changed, his appearance is changed. Peter, James, and John see this, and what they see, or at least they think they see, that they testify they see, is that Jesus is changed, but then Moses and Elijah have met Jesus on this mountain as well. And this blows their mind. And textually speaking, Jesus would say, "I'm the fulfillment of the law and the prophets." And that moment is like the law, Moses, and the prophets, Elijah, meet Jesus. And they have this incredible heavenly, otherworldly experience. Elijah, the imagination of where Elijah went and what he became carries on and on and on all the way through the story of the history of the Jewish people. It's because there's no articulation of his death. Even the people who have witnessed this can't hardly wrap their mind around what has just happened. But Elisha can. He knows what's coming. He's sad, but he's a truth teller throughout this whole situation. And I think it's fascinating what happens in this text, because Elijah keeps trying to separate himself from Elisha, but Elijah has become so dedicated to him that he must go. Doesn't matter what is facing, up hills, up mountains, through rivers, I'm going to follow you till the very end. And we have this incredible story where Elijah needs to cross the Jordan, so he hits with his cloak in the water, and the water parts. And if you're a careful reader with a careful understanding of the Old Testament, this is supposed to harken back to the slaves being freed, that Moses himself parted the water. And so waters part, you should be like, oh, this is Moses stuff. And Elijah walks across, and when they get to the other side, he turns to the guy he's been mentoring, and he says, "What can I give you? Do you need some parting wisdom? Do you need a last word? What do you want?" And Elisha says, "I want a double portion of your spirit." And Elijah says, I thought I could give you a piece of clothing or something. What double portion of my spirit? You've asked for an awful lot. How many of us, it's going to get hard here for a second, okay? Buckle in. How many of us have someone along for the journey with us, that they've seen our spirit, our presence, our walk with God, and they think, I want that? How many of us are exuding this sort of life with God that's so calming, that's so powerful, that's so mysterious, if you will? Like that obviously doesn't come from the sort of world we live in. How many people look upon us and say, I want not only what you have, but double it up for me? Elijah doesn't know how to bottle this. He doesn't know how to commodify it. He doesn't know how to hand it on. So he says, you've asked for a lot, but listen, just watch what God is going to do. And I suspect if you see it, you'll receive it. And so Elijah is taken up into heaven in what's described as a whirlwind. And as he goes, his cloak, his piece of fabric falls. And Elisha takes it and he puts it upon himself. And he walks back and he gets to the same Jordan that Elijah has just split and walked through. And Elisha takes the cloak and he does the same thing Elijah does, and he whacks the water and the water splits again. I just think this moment is absolutely incredible. Because first of all, like when you're following the man of God and miracles are happening, how are you getting back home? But Elisha has received from his mentor, and then he immediately turns around and does exactly what his mentor just did. Like, that's a good mentor-mentee relationship, right? You don't want the people who are coming behind you or alongside of you who are following you to be less than you. You want to bring people along and help them to be as much or more than you have ever been. And it seems to me that for all of the ills, all of the struggles, all the problems that the world we live in has, and listen, they are many. There are so many of them. And you and I are not the singular antidote to all of the problems in the world. We're not going to fix it. We're not the solution, right? But if there's anything in this text that I think is helpful in calling and shaping to me is, if you have anything to offer it, offer it. Bring someone along with you. Have someone that you're mentoring. Because how will what we have, if we have anything good at all, how will it carry on? Well, we're passing it on to someone. We have someone coming with us and we're giving it to them. We're sharing our wisdom. We're sharing our knowledge. We're sharing our resources. We're sharing our time. And we're bringing them along with us. I heard someone say one time, I think this is so helpful, that every Christian should have someone who's in front of them and someone who is behind them, that they can name and articulate in their life. Someone from whose strength and wisdom you're drawing from, that you can call them up, that you can text them, that you can meet them for breakfast or dinner, and they will pour into you, and they will tell you it's going to be okay. And they'll tell you the hard stories of when they've been through and how God has helped them, that there's someone that you can draw from, but that you should not be a reservoir of all of that. You should also have someone that you're bringing along behind you as well. How would the world and the church change if we all took that seriously? That we could at least name one person in front of us and one person behind us. Someone that we're seriously being mentored by and someone who we're seriously mentoring as well. Now, we can't solve all the problems of the world. But you might be able to solve most of the problems in the world for one person. And think about how different the world could be if all of us started stacking that on top one after another for each other. What if we could just solve the problems, or at least listen to, or at least meet with one person and help them? In this world that we're in today, there is a vacuum of kindness and care. And I suspect whatever group rises up and answers that vacuum is going to be the one that has the biggest say in the society that is coming. Whoever is willing to meet the moment with kindness and empathy and care and wisdom, right? Care, like wisdom isn't always just being nice. Care isn't always just being nice, right? Whoever's willing to meet this moment will gain a foothold into the society that emerges out of this moment that we're in. And Christians, we can remember what our roots are. We may feel marginalized. We may feel like no one cares. We may feel like we're losing power. But what's really interesting is in the first century, Christians had zero power, less than power. The narratives were that they were terrible. People on the street, if you met the average person in the Roman world and asked them what they thought about Christians, they would probably say they're atheists, they're cannibals, and they're revolutionaries. Well, those are pretty terrible things to be. Atheists, they were called because they didn't believe in the gods. Romans believed in the pantheon of gods, and Christians did not. So they were atheists. They were cannibals because when they got together, they ate the blood and body of their Lord Jesus. It's pretty weird. Who eats the body of someone else? Cannibals. And they were revolutionaries because they would walk around saying that Jesus was Lord and not Caesar. So they were political problems. They were religious problems. They were seen as nothing, the lowest rung of society. They were marginalized, and they were seen as so strange and so weird that if they were found in public, they were executed to try to stamp out this religious movement. But rather than fighting, rather than yelling, Rather than logging on to Facebook and having their say, these Christians cared for the poor. They found babies that were being abandoned, and they nursed them to life. They welcomed people of all nationalities and backgrounds into their meetings. They treated women well. They trained people up in their faith. And they had real answers for the way the world was and what it could be. And each century after that, the influence of the church grew, and it grew from the bottom up rather than trying to enter into powerful places and to move from the top down. What if we returned to our roots and cared for people, loved people, helped people, walked through difficulty with people, and helped them win in ways that it feels so helpless to win in our society today? Now, I've been talking about the prophets this last month, and prophets are great. I love prophets. They have a lot to say. They talk a lot of junk. They speak truth when no one wants to hear it. The prophets are fun. But the prophets have limitations. The prophets have limitations. They can name the problems. They can identify the center of what's wrong with the world. They can walk up to kings and grab them by the scruff of the neck and even say, "You're the problem, fix it, dude." And yeah, that's right, get them. But the prophets can't change anything. They only identify the problems. They yell and they scream. They make people feel something. Might be anger that they feel. It might be empathy that they feel. It might be confession that they feel. But prophets make people feel things, but they can't actually change lives and hearts. They just make their point, and they make people mad. There's a limitation to prophets. A lot of us today, I think, want to be prophets. We want to read articles. We want to listen to podcasts. We want to read books and then tell everything what's wrong with everyone. But prophets don't fix anything, and they don't fix anyone. Identifying the problems has its limits. And so while we've talked about the prophet this month, and it's been good, I think, let's remember that eventually it's Jesus that we long for. It's Jesus that can fix us. It's Jesus that can fix our world. It's Jesus that can change a heart. Because prophets, they get taken up into heaven. They get celebrated. They've done good work. Nice job, buddy. But Jesus doesn't get taken up into heaven on a chariot as a victor of this world. Instead, he sees our condition and our problem, and he humbles himself to a cross, where he takes upon the burden of all of our life, our sin, our loneliness, our disease, our brokenness. He takes on all of the burden of this world that leads to death, and he nails himself to the cross on our behalf. He does this so that our lives can be changed, because we can be forgiven for what we've done rather than shamed for what we've done. Prophets shame us. Jesus doesn't shame us. Jesus sees our shame and says, "Let me have that so that your burden can be lighter." He sees our sin. He sees our mistakes. He doesn't keep pointing it out saying, "Oh, you don't measure up. You're not good enough." He says, I've seen that you're not good enough, but I want to cleanse you and give you a new start. The prophets are great, but they can't fix your heart. They can't give you a fresh start. They can't give you a do-over, but Jesus does. And starting next week, we're going to talk about Jesus all the way up until Easter. And in this transitional moment, I want to say to you, see Jesus. Open your heart to Jesus. Accept Jesus. Become aware of Jesus. Find what Jesus has done for you. And stop listening to the narrative about how you're not good enough, you don't live up, or you're just fine, you're doing great, keep living into your problems. All of these narratives that we get, all this confusion in this world, Jesus says, "I'll take it all. I'm enough. You are forgiven, you are set free, you've got a new start in me." And so as we close up today, the band is going to sing us a final song, and I would love for you to stand and sing along with it as well. But if you've not yet met Jesus, today would be a great start because we're going to be talking about him together for weeks, and you can lean into learning more and more, and I hope that you do. Jesus wants to give you a new start. He sees all of the trouble that Elijah points to, all of the prophecy, all of the truth-telling. It's all there, but Jesus deals with it. And in him, you can have a fresh start, a new life. And all you need to do is accept that, receive it, say yes to that. Don't leave today without saying yes to Jesus. And if you do want to say yes to Jesus, you can come to an altar and pray. You can stop me on the way out. I'm usually by the door. Most of you hope I don't shake your hand. You just walk by like, oh, there's the preacher. That guy was just on stage. But if you're interested in saying yes to Jesus, stop and tell me, and I'll help you out. Because there's a burden in this world. There's a struggle, and it keeps getting closer and closer to our homes and our hearts and our lives. And Jesus can deal with it. Jesus can help. Jesus can make all things new. Would you stand with me as we close out our service today? And let's sing together in praise.